Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman Family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman Family JCC is an incubator for new expressions of Jewish identity. It creates innovative Jewish learning, celebrations, and arts programs that inspire personal connections to people and ideas from across the Jewish world. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is a special bonus episode of Judaism Unbound, the Jewish Comics Anthology. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And we are here today with a special midweek bonus because it's a very timely issue. The folks that we're going to be interviewing today are currently running a Kickstarter campaign. That's an online platform that allows groups to raise money to do something really interesting that they need some funding ahead of time to be able to do. Our guest today, Andy Stanleigh, who is the president and chief visual engineer of Alternative History Comics, and Stephen Bergson, who is the editor of a book called The Jewish Comics Anthology Volume 1, and is the prospective editor of a book called Psi, The Jewish Comics Anthology Volume 2, which is going to be taking Jewish stories and giving them a sci-fi flavor. They have put together a Kickstarter campaign to raise money to put out Volume 2 of the Jewish Comics Anthology, and I have to say that I'm a backer of this project. We're really excited about seeing this book and reading this book, and we're really hoping to get some of our listeners excited about the project and also do a deep dive into why Jewish comics and Jewish science fiction is something worth doing. I should note that as we're posting this episode in mid-November, there's about a month left on the Kickstarter campaign, and they're probably somewhere between a third and a halfway there. So this episode is really timely, and if you want to get your hands on the book, hopefully you'll be able to support them, and there's actually some ways that you can subscribe to this Kickstarter and actually get Volume 1 as well, which is extremely hard to find. So we're going to have information about the Kickstarter campaign in the show notes for this episode. We urge our listeners to go check it out. Those of you who, like me, love science fiction and comics, we hope that you'll become backers of this project. So we're really excited today to welcome Andy Stanleigh and Stephen Bergson. Andy and Steve, welcome to Judaism Unbound. It's great to have you.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Great. Well, we're really excited to have you on because it just so happens that we're about to start a series of episodes where we're exploring people who are not professional Jews or Jewish professionals who are going out and creating interesting Jewish creations. We were thinking along the lines of new organizations and new communities, but when we came across your Kickstarter where you were putting together the funding to launch Volume 2 of the Jewish Comics Anthology, we were really excited, both because we're fans of comics and Jewish comics, but also just because we thought this was another great example of the kinds of things that regular Jews go out and do. So what we wanted to find out, just to get started, was a little bit about this project, and especially this being Volume 2 of the anthology. If you could tell us a little bit about Volume 1, and then what do you have in store for Volume 2?
I've been kind of collecting Jewish stories, usually comic book length or graphic novel length, in comics form for some time. And I noticed that there were a whole bunch of shorter stories. And I thought, sometimes they were in obscure comics, and I thought, if someone would just take these out and put them together, you'd have about half a book's worth. And then if we commission new stories just like these, that would be a whole book. And maybe someone would want to publish it, and other people would want to buy it. So I'd been tossing around the idea and suggesting it to people for years until I finally came across Andy Stanleigh. And when I pitched it to him, he said, yeah, let's go and do this book. And it got realized, and now we're into the second volume.
Volume 2 is, like Stephen said, the first volume was half reprinted of old stories. And there were reprints from Marvel Comics, from DC Comics. There was a story edited by Stan Lee, Will Eisner, Art Spiegelman, all the massive big names helped contribute to Volume 1. So it's part reprints, part new material. Volume 2 is all new, all original stories. So there'll be 18 stories, and I don't have to explain why the number 18 is significant. And what we're doing is, it's the same premise. They're short stories, They're all based on, what I call the ancient folk tales, myths, legends from Hebrew culture. But the twist is we are reimagining them as sci-fi stories. So all these ancient fables and even some small lines in the Torah that give a hint of a larger story that it was just never told. We're actually having our authors tell these stories as robust things, but putting them in a sci-fi setting.
And what's your thought process of doing that in the sci-fi setting? Like, first of all, like, how did that idea come about? And second of all, sort of, what is it about? What are you trying to achieve by doing it that way?
One of the main things is exploring a way of Jewish storytelling that isn't normally done. You don't see a lot of Jewish sci-fi, especially a collection of short stories like this. Completely original work. And that was one of the main considerations for me as a publisher is you don't want to just give the same thing. What is it that people haven't seen before? But also in exploring this and doing this exercise, we're able to take these stories and really update them and put them into different characters' hands and see what it is that comes out, exploring different ideas, modern interpretations of certain rules and laws, and what would that look like in the future? So what would certain, for example, Passover kosher laws, how would that work on a moon base on a ship when you may not have access to, to certain kosher foods? How about the character who, in the Torah, the nursing father who suddenly sprang forth milk from his own bosom to feed a child? What is that like, not just in contemporary society when we're talking about all the trans and LGBTQ movements that are happening and equality rights all across the world, but what's that like in the future as well?
I definitely know that Dan and I have 1.5 million follow-ups about the comics anthology in particular. But before we delve deep in, can you give us a little bit about your own Jewish backgrounds and how you live your Jewish lives today?
I think I see my Jewish identity in 3 parts. The one part is my personal family life. I'm the father of twin boys, and when I come home, depending on what time of year it is and what circumstances are going on in my life, like if somebody dies and I'm going to sit Shiva, or if there's a Jewish holiday, then I'll participate in the rituals. I'll share the traditions with my family. Then there's my 9 to 5, 5 days a week day job where I'm working for United Jewish Appeal, one of the biggest, if not the biggest, Jewish charity in Canada. And even though I'm just doing basically data processing, being part of that community and helping that community, you can't help but feel connected to the local Jewish world. And then the third part is my being a Jewish comics ambassador, where I'm trying to promote Jewish graphic novels both to the comics world and to the Jewish world, which may not think that highly of comics and graphic novels.
I throw around the word culture a lot, and it's something that one of the artists themselves identified themselves as. They called themselves a cultural Jew. When I was a kid, I grew up in St. Catharines, which was a small city in southern Ontario. And so that was where we only had 2 temples. One of them was continuously attacked by neo-Nazis in the 80s. So the Judaism always kept a low profile in that particular city. And my father was the president of the temple. We went to services every Friday night, went to Hebrew school. But most of my family, my uncles and aunts and cousins lived in Toronto. And when we would drive to Toronto for, Hanukkah parties, Passover, all the high holidays, it was such a different vibe that I was able to experience, that people were not keeping a low profile, shuttling into services and then going home. The Jewish community in Toronto was so large and so vibrant, and a lot of other cities, Montreal, New York. It was really a celebration of community and culture, and that's something that as I got older, I started to really identify with. Personally, my wife is Catholic, but we raise our kids identifying with both. They perform the rituals from both cultures. They enjoy the different holidays. They observe all the respective traditions of both sides.
I'm curious because we're in a moment, at least as far as I can tell, and the two of you would know much more than I about this, but it seems like largely due to movies that have come out, that comic books and comic book characters are experiencing a major kind of renaissance. And I'm wondering, because I've read little hints of pieces here and there talking about like the Jewish parts of that Renaissance and what makes these. I mean, there's some obvious examples of, you can point to characters, even villains that are Jewish in some of these stories. But there seems to be, especially in the list you just named off, rattled off, Eisner, Spiegelman, like it's not very difficult to name Jewish comic book writers. And I'm curious if you, from your vantage point, there's something to that there's something to this medium that seems to be something that Jews or Judaism can easily be latched onto.
An argument can be made that part of the reason why there were successful Jewish cartoonists and Jewish writers in the comic book business is because they knew how to tell stories without being too overt about their Jewish background. But then a generation or two, it shifted later where people like Spiegelman could say, I'm comfortable telling a Holocaust story. Or Trina Robbins, I'm comfortable talking about the Triangle fire that she had a personal connection to. And so it's not just about being in the business now, it's also about telling your stories or telling stories that come from your culture.
There's definitely sort of a turn of the tide. Jews have always been great storytellers, and yeah, they've definitely done it in such a way that they're able to tell Jewish stories without faith-based messaging or religious understanding of it. And that's one of the goals of Psy, the Jewish Comics Anthology Volume 2 as well, is that, I like to say the stories are based on Hebrew culture. They're cultural tales. There's no preaching, there's no religion. So you don't have to have any preconceived notions or understanding of Jewish faith, to enjoy these stories.
Can you give us, no spoilers, of course, but is there, can you give us a little bit of a window into some of the stories and what, like, without telling, the full story, what some examples are of how the Hebrew culture blends with the comic medium?
There's one which sometimes is called The Little Old House, or It Could Always Be Worse, where somebody who's trying to make a situation better goes for advice from someone who finds little ways of making the situation worse and worse and worse, until finally the answer to his problem is, get rid of all the stuff that we told you to get in the first place. So the traditional tale is, he takes place in a little shtetl, a little village. So take the chickens inside, take the turkeys inside, take the cow inside and the horse, until there's so much chaos in the house. Then in the end, the rabbi says, now take all the animals back outside. And it's such a relief not to have all this chaos in the house anymore. But all he's done is it's circular. He's gone back to the way things were before, but he has a different perspective on it.
And so how does that get translated in the sci-fi version?
That was one of the ones that's more a straightforward sci-fi interpretation where, instead of just a farmer, it's a zookeeper of exotic alien animals. And I mean, it's just as simple as that, something like that. Even ones like Story of the Climb, which is about an old man who watches from his window as boys are trying to climb a pole that's up against another large building that's uninhabited, and all the boys keep falling, except one finally makes it to the top. And the old man says, how come everyone else failed where you were able to make it to the top? And the story was, everyone kept looking down to see how far they've climbed and fell back, but I was the only one that looked up and concentrated on where I was going. And I mean, that's a message that's in all of our, a lot of our stories and texts in Jewish culture, but that's something that's also shared by everybody. So it's definitely something that's, that's connected to. The way that we're sci-fiing it is we're kind of building in a little bit of this takes place thousands of years in the future. So the buildings are actually old ships that have crashed on a planet. and the climb has become somewhat of a ritual for the community to get to the top, because nobody's ever made it to the top of the tallest ship.
Is there like a mission? Is there like a deep desire that you have in these? And no is a perfectly acceptable answer. It can also just be that it's worthwhile to tell good stories. But is there a particular shift you'd love to see in the Jewish world towards like an embrace of comics or of art in a different way, or vice versa? Is there a shift you'd like to see in the world of comics where there's more of an interest in culture or religious traditions? Is there some need out there that you're looking to fill with these kinds of with these comics?
Just speaking from my perspective and as a publisher, I see that shift happening in public schools and regular schools. We sell a lot of books to libraries, school programs, university courses. I personally don't see, now Stephen can correct me if I'm wrong, because he's in on the synagogue libraries and library system. I don't see a lot of comic book or graphic novels being accepted as educational or teaching tools for students and youth. I could be wrong, but I'd love to see more.
I've seen it in my years. I've been involved in the Association of Jewish Libraries for about 20 years. And I've seen a change. I've seen where it was kind of unusual for libraries and library collections and for librarians to be interested in graphic books. And it's gotten more respect. And I've met with colleagues who are also interested in expanding their graphic novel collections. I try to see myself as a bit of a Jewish comics ambassador, and that works two ways. I try to represent the Jewish content and promote the Jewish content to the larger comics world, but I also try to represent comics to the larger Jewish reading public. And it's been a bit of an uphill climb, but I think, just looking at the success of the first Kickstarter and looking at how they discuss graphic novels in publications by the Jewish Book Council. And there have been Jewish graphic novels that have won awards, like Barry Deutsch's Yearville won a Sidney Taylor Award some years back.
Well, yeah. Not to mention Art Spiegelman's Mouse that won the Pulitzer Prize.
Right. When I was a freshman in high school, I was assigned Mouse, and it was mind-blowing for me on a number of levels. I felt like I was cheating in school, truthfully. Like, I felt like obviously the teacher assigned it to me, so they knew, but I was like, my homework is to read I know it's a graphic novel, but I would have probably said at the time, my homework is to read a comic strip. Like that's do they know that I'm doing this? Like that's school. But then when I actually read the book, and even within the first few pages, you get a sense it's deep and there's a lot going on. And then my Jewish pride button started to get pushed because I was one of the only Jewish kids in my school. This was not assigned to me at like a Jewish day school. I was the only, or maybe I was probably the only Jewish kid in this particular class. There were only 4 or 5 in my entire grade. And having conversations with my friends where they were super stoked to read this book all about Judaism, largely because it was a graphic novel and they felt like me that they were cheating. It was an incredibly cool experience. So I'm glad you brought up Art Spiegelman because that's had an important role in my life.
I hope so. Yeah. And like you said about your friends being interested in reading the book as well. I mean, that's also, one of a great goal to reach as well, is to get more people, reading these stories, that wouldn't normally pick it up. People who aren't Jewish themselves or don't have the insight into the Jewish history and the culture, who might be interested in reading some of these great stories and learning a little bit more, and doing it in such a way that's like you said, it's deep. The stories aren't comic booky. There's no superheroes. There's no flying capes. There's no special powers. So it's like a great introduction, not just to cultural stories, but to graphic novels as well.
Yeah, I'd love to talk about that a little bit further, both I think on the comics dimension and on the sci-fi dimension, because as I was preparing for this interview, I kind of went over to my bookshelf, and I'm actually a pretty big sci-fi fan and a pretty big comics fan, and I, pulled off the Jewish sci-fi books from my shelf, and it was actually quite a very small collection. They basically fit in one hand. And the Jewish comics part of my library is larger, but the Jewish sci-fi part of that is pretty much limited to Douglas Rushkoff's Testament books. And so I'm curious about your thoughts on both the art form of comics and what does it sort of contribute that's different from the other genres of Jewish literature that might be out there. Like, what do you think that comics can achieve that other forms of books can't? And I guess I wanted to float another thought by you and see what you thought about it, which was that to create a Jewish science fiction movie, right, would cost hundreds of millions of dollars, most likely, or $100 million, and it would probably never happen. You wouldn't be able to get the funding, and yet here you are with a Kickstarter trying to raise only $40,000, which is a lot, but it's nothing like $100 million, and you're going to be able to produce this incredible book at the end of it. And I should note that I'm a backer at $50. I think that's $50 Canadian, actually. And you actually get both volumes of the book. So I think it's so cool that, for a relatively modest price, you can buy these two incredible books. And then for a relatively modest total sum, you're able to produce something that's actually, not quite a Jewish sci-fi movie, but not that far in many ways. And so I'm curious, if that's part of your thinking as well, or how you just sort of think of the whole project and what it's all about for you.
That is a heavy question.
That's our specialty.
My thoughts, just as the publisher, is just to create a fantastic collection that I hope people will want to read. I mean, that's the long and short of it for me. I'm hopeful that it's, this can kind of act as a way for, parents. I'm 40 myself. I've got 2 young kids. I love reading comics and graphic novels. Sometimes I read things that, oh my God, I kind of want to learn more about that, and then I'll go research. I'll go on the internet or I'll go to the library. And that's a way for me to kind of introduce myself into more information and culture. And so this is, not just Judaism in general, but just in the average society, comics and graphic novels are a great way to introduce people, young and old, to little snippets, to little vignettes of certain moments or certain parts of a history or a culture. So hopefully they'll read these little snippets, these little short stories in this book and say, I want to learn more.
But I think there's also this element, I'm thinking of the science fiction book Hyperion, and there's a chapter there that takes place on a Jewish planet. And many of my Jewish friends who are sci-fi fans, they're so excited to read the chapter in Hyperion that has to do with the Jewish planet. And there's sort of so little Jews in space. And, I think it's really interesting to find these ways to give Jewish kids and frankly Jewish adults, right, that experience of how does Judaism connect with the future that we're going into, and not just tearing our hair out over will the Jews be continuing in the future or whatever, but no, actually let's explore what would it look like if Judaism encountered artificial intelligence? What would it look like if Judaism was trying to exist on another planet, like you said, with all of the differences that there might be? And I think that, right, it's really challenging to achieve that in long form novels or in movies, because they require such an expense and such an amount of time to put in with maybe not as large of a market. And it's so interesting it feels to me like you've hit upon a way of squaring that circle to some extent and really contributing something that I think people are going to enjoy a lot, and that I think also has the potential to provoke a lot of interesting and important thinking in the Jewish community about, this is really our podcast is about, if we're going into the Jewish future, what should we be thinking about? Not just what are we thinking about, but what should we be thinking about?
2 of the stories we have are going to be dealing with artificial intelligence.
For example, one of the stories is about a school teacher who has somehow through the original idea is about through prayer and technology together, she's able to create souls. What are the implications of that? And that's definitely something that's going to be explored in the story, is how would that be approached, by the Jewish people, by the congregation, and even, dare we say, by God himself. There is another story that involves, it's called Babel. So the story Babel is about artificial intelligence itself has found a way to program souls into being. What are the implications of that? And that story is going to be both really interesting, really thought-provoking, but also fun, because it's sort of your Captain Deckard, trench-coated, grizzled veteran detective who's on the force, who's investigating this. So it's got some great Blade Runner vibes, but also really connected to some really thought-provoking religious philosophy.
So can we talk a little bit about your using Kickstarter to fund this project? Because I think that Kickstarter may be something that our listeners are not totally familiar with. And I think it's really fascinating how you're going forward with this interesting Jewish project, right? And you're not out there seeking a grant from a foundation, and you're not out there trying to get members. You're using this crowdfunding vehicle. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came upon the idea of doing that, how it went with the first volume, and just how the whole thing works in terms of your trying to run a business that's basically based on this notion of getting the potential consumers to fund the business before they've received the product.
It's definitely really interesting. And Kickstarter as a platform originally started as a way for sort of inventors and a lot of technology projects to be done. People can post videos of their work in progress, but it really took on a life of its own when graphic novels and films and creative projects started to come into being. So for volume 1, I was very excited to give it a try, and it was great to see that it was successful. We were able to raise over 54,000 Canadian for the project, which was fantastic. And I mean, it's important to note that the numbers sound high, but every single dollar goes to the authors, to the artists, and to print the first run of the books, and all the rewards that the people get for pledging to the campaign. And it gets the community, it gets a large amount of people involved in creating and being able to make this project. And that's one of the great things about doing projects like this, like the Jewish Comics Anthology, like the Indigenous Comics Collection, which we did, which were also successful Kickstarter campaigns. These projects that are about Judaism is a culture of community, it's a culture of history, and so getting people together to help support this project is what Kickstarter is all about.
Well, thanks to both of you for coming on. This has been a great conversation, and I'd encourage folks to go and contribute so that the second one becomes a reality soon.
Thank you very much.
We want to encourage all of you out there to go and check out this anthology and to help make it happen. And as a reminder, you can do that on Kickstarter. You can go to Kickstarter and search Sci Jewish Comics if you'd like, Sci SCI, or you can just type in jewishcomicsanthology.com. And you'll get redirected to the Kickstarter page. So definitely go ahead and do that. We want to close out this bonus episode by encouraging all of you to be in touch with us, Dan and Lex. And there are a few ways for you to do that. First, you can head to our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Second, you can check out our website, judaismunbound.com. And last but not least, you can always hit us up via email at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last plug we like to make is that you can always support us with a financial donation, either on a monthly recurring basis or just one time, and you can do either of those at judaismunbound.com/donate. Thanks so much for listening, and with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.